My expertise is about the early exploration of the West Coast. I've been very interested, born in California. As Diane said, we lived in Alaska for a long, long time. And so I've written on the history of the area and particularly the voyages of Captain James Cook and George Vancouver. Many people, Americans particularly, do not know much about Cook or Vancouver because, of course, they were British. And I'm going to put Cook and Vancouver into context with the other exploration that occurred in this area. But my focus today is Oregon country. And there's a map of Oregon country. And just so you understand, this is not just the state of Oregon or the territory of Oregon, but Oregon country as it was defined by the British and the Americans. And it extends from the current California border all the way up to southeast Alaska. And southeast Alaska was not considered Oregon country because the Russians occupied it in a place they called Russian America during this era. But I'm going to start not with the humans, the Euro-American occupation, but I want to start with the occupation of the Native Americans and Canadians because their story is an important one and of course is much, much longer than the Euro-American occupation of the area. So I have a couple of Alaskans in the room and they're going to fact check me on everything I talk about Alaska. But I think you all know about this. Beringia in the last ice age was exposed. It was as wide as 600 miles and it occurred between 25 and 15,000 years ago, BP meaning before present. And there is some controversy about how they came to Oregon, but Oregon serves as a very important part of this controversy, and so I want to describe it to you. Clovis was the initial belief of archaeologists as to how America was settled. The belief was they came down, native people came down Beringia into Alaska between 11 and 15,000 years ago, and 15,000 is an important number because anything before that, Beringia probably didn't exist. And before 15,000, there was so much ice in Canada, basically, that it would be impossible for the people to come down here. And so the Clovis theory came, and it was believed for many years by archaeologists that that was the only way that Native Americans came to North America. And this is their route of travel. Now understand, it was just a few thousand people. It wasn't a mass migration. They didn't know where they were going. They were just following the game. And when they got through Alaska, they only could find an ice-free corridor. And as I say, it opened up after about 15,000 years ago. And so the Clovis first theory also recognizes specific Clovis points, which is how they hunted mastodons and the like, very unique, and this is what archaeologists focus on. Then there came more recently alternative theories, and the alternative theories feature Oregon quite prominently. For those of you who are not aware of it, the 8 Paisley Caves in central Oregon were present over 1,000 years before the earliest evidence of Clovis. In other words, the Oregonians came before Clovis, completely setting archaeology on its head. There's also a site in western Idaho, and there are sites in South America and Mexico that also prove that Native Americans came from Siberia long before the Clovis people came through the ice sheets. And this is a picture of the carbon dating that's occurred for the alternate settlement theories. And you can see that based on the years that you see there, they all precede the time that the ice would have been open to allow people to travel to Clovis. These are pictures of Paisley Caves. You can't know exactly where they are. I'm sure you know where Paisley is, but the caves are in that area, very important to archaeology, and I think we as Oregonians should be aware of them. In addition to the Paisley Caves, at nearby Fort Rock Cave, archaeologists have found 95 well-preserved sagebrush sandals, also ranging in this very ancient period. These are the oldest surviving shoes, and of course appropriate for Oregon, right? So the point about these geological studies is that we now have a significant evidence that Clovis first wasn't first, and that because of the Paisley Caves and others, we've been able to demonstrate that, or archaeologists have been able to demonstrate that there was a different kind of native migration that occurred. And of course, because Beringia wouldn't have existed then, because it was before the Ice Age, the assumption is that they came along the water's edge. And for those of you who are familiar with these gigantic ice sheets that existed 15,000 years ago, the only way they could have come down is down the coast. And since the ice sheets more or less ended at the Columbia River, it's likely that the first place that they entered was Oregon. And that's why Paisley Caves is so significant to archaeologists. I give you I'm not an archaeologist nor an ethnographer, but I think we all know that there was a significant native presence in the Northwest coast. Our area is considered the North Great Basin, but the Great Basin extended, between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada. As you go further north to the Columbia, you have a different kind of a Northwest Coast Indian, and they have been studied at some length. I think the important thing for us to take home as Oregonians is until 1959, when Celilo Falls was dammed, it was considered the oldest continuously inhabited community on the continent. So when you think about Oregon prehistory, you've got two very important factors that really no other state can boast about, except of course Alaska, because they all came to Alaska first. But significantly, Paisley Caves being one of the first sites, and Celilo Falls, a place where natives congregated because the salmon were easy to harvest there. I want to talk a little about what happened to the native people, and I'm of course focus on Oregon country. But it was a substantial population decline, not so much because of conquest and colonization, but because of European diseases. At the time of Columbus, the current estimate is about 50 million natives lived in North and South America. And you can see the distribution, about 4 million in the United States and Canada, so only about 10%, many more in Mexico and South America. in the following 4 centuries, these outbreaks of European diseases, as well as warfare, slavery, and other effects of European contact, resulted in a decrease by as much as 80%. So a very, very substantial mortality rate at the hand of principally European diseases. In analyzing the population in Canada and the United States, it's believed that California had the largest number of native people, probably 500,000. But second to California was the Northwest coast, that is Oregon country as I've defined it today. And you can see the number of tribes. Not so many out where we are, though you can see the Northern Paiute and the Molalla, which were more Cascade-oriented people in our area, but just a huge number of varying tribes up and down the coast and in the Willamette Valley. This does not take you into British Columbia, but a very significant population there. 1/3 of the Native Americans, that's to describe the population in California. But again, in the pre-contact population was reduced by 1/3 during the Spanish and Mexican regimes. In Oregon and Washington, another 1/3 died before any whites came to the region. Imagine that. 1/3 of your brothers and sisters and parents are dying off for completely unknown causes, and there's no presence of any white people or any other foreign interloper. It's believed to have occurred just because white people came in contact with tribes closer to where white people lived and carried their diseases faster than even the white settlement occurred. There was a smallpox epidemic in 1781 that occurred at the same time as an epidemic throughout North America, and smallpox was the substantial killer. This is a scientific analysis. I don't know if you can see the map very well, but it pinpoints epidemics that occurred in various regions of the Pacific Northwest, the area that we're considering here today. And as you can see, it was pretty substantial and pretty grim. Vancouver, who I'll talk to you about a little bit later, was the first European to map Puget Sound. And he kept coming across these abandoned villages. And at first he thought, well, they've just gone off hunting or they've gone off fishing and this is their permanent home. But he later concluded that the people had simply died off and the area was simply depopulated. At no very remote period, he wrote, this country had been far more populous than at present. It's a pretty significant entry in his journal, constant entries, when he cruises Puget Sound, that he finds very few living native people, but a lot of abandoned villages. There's a great deal of evidence actually about this because we also know that Lewis and Clark saw it. I quote a Haida chief here saying that the smallpox had killed 2/3 of their people. So that's the context of Euro-American advance into this area. And that is that the population of the native people, which was once robust, was falling at a dramatic rate. Now, from a Euro-American perspective, of course, we like maps. And this is a map of the world in the early 18th century. And as you can see, every other place in the world is mapped except west coast of North America and interior Canada. A more detailed map of North America shows you that the Hudson Bay Company had occupied the area of Hudson Bay. There were some fur hunters moving further west. The Spanish knew as far as maybe the coast of Oregon, the boundary line of modern day Oregon, and I'll explain how that happened. But otherwise, it was a blank slate. Lots of rumors. I could spend hours talking to you about just the rumors, but in any event, for actual knowledge, vacant. And it's interesting how the knowledge came to pass. And I'm going to give you a quick history going way back. Of course, we all remember that 1492 is when Columbus came to the New World. And within 50 years, Cortez had a number of sailors visit the West Coast and attempt to find what was north. 20 years after the conquest of the Aztecs, Ulloa, U-L-L-O-A, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, Ulloa. In any event, he reached the outside of Baja California. So very quickly they were at least in Baja California. Then they sent Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, and he entered the waters of Alta California, that is the current state of California, in 1542, 50 years after Columbus. So there was some pretty significant investigation of at least Southern California. But the significant problem that the Spanish had and they couldn't overcome was scurvy, the deficiency of vitamin C, which frequently killed off half the crew of any extended voyage. And by extended voyage, I mean 6-8 months. So they were not very successful. Sir Francis Drake came along, and he was a privateer, pirate, on behalf of Queen Elizabeth. And he came up the west coast of South America, raiding village after village, ship after ship, and filled his Golden Hind with significant loot, such that it funded the British government for many years and enabled them to withstand, at least in part, the attack by the Spanish during the time of the Spanish Armada. But this is a picture of the Golden Hind, and to the left is a map that was drawn at the time, not by Drake. He never said where he was. But the significant point is that Drake, after having cruised South America, stopped somewhere along the coast. And it is believed today that that was Point Reyes National Seashore. But for those of you who are Oregonians, there's a lot of speculation that it might have been in Oregon. The only evidence is this map and a few European-oriented pictographs that really didn't mean much or help archaeologists to figure out where he actually was. This map of Portus Novae Albionis appeared on a map prepared in England and is the only known map that Drake saw and confirmed where he landed. But of course, it doesn't tell you where he is. But the assumption is because they described hills like the cliffs of Dover, that it was probably Drake's Bay in California. However, Oregonians have speculated, anywhere Anywhere there's a bay. And for decades, historians did this. Retired historians would drive along the coast and figure out which bays looked like the the port that I showed you in the previous picture. And so Oregonians think it's either Whale Cove or Nehalem Bay, but there are some historians who have posited British Columbia, and even a couple of really risky ones who suggest Alaska. But again, it's believed that it is, in fact, a Point Reyes. Now, the Spanish stopped looking. Not only was scurvy difficult for them, but they also had a better cause. Obviously, the reason Columbus sailed in the first place was primarily commercial. He wanted to get those spices from India, and of course, he thought he was in India when he landed. But when the Spanish figured out how narrow Mexico was, they established ports on the west coast and began the Manila galleon trade. These were the largest wooden ships ever, huge ships, and they were just laden with goods going both directions, and they would sail twice a year. And for 250 years, these journeys sailed offshore Oregon and California, but they never landed, and they never investigated Oregon or California at all. Two are believed to have foundered. I think you've probably heard about the beeswax that's been found in the area of Astoria and Seaside and down the coast from there. There's another one in the area of Drake's Bay. But nonetheless, no information. The Spanish weren't interested in this area. Vizcaíno was sent after the galleon trade began to look for places that the galleons could stop on their way south on their return voyage from the Philippines. And Vizcaíno looked at various ports settling on Monterey. His consort ship under the command of Aguilar, Martin de Aguilar, probably reached Oregon. So we've got Drake and Aguilar who have probably reached Oregon, but they had no idea they were in Oregon and turned quickly south. 200 years pass. Nothing is happening on our side of the coast after all the frenzy of those early years. And Peter the Great gets the big idea that he wants to go to North America. He first wants to understand where Asia ends and where America begins. And so he sends Vitus Bering on 2 expeditions. The first one defining where Bering Strait is, which is the division between Asia and America. And then the second one, a disastrous one, touched on a series of locations, but they really didn't have a sense of what the North American continent looked like. The consort ship was able to get back safely, but Bering was unable to get back safely and died on an island 50 or so miles from Kamchatka. Nonetheless, on that island in Kamchatka, they discovered sea otter furs. They brought back a couple of dozen furs in a small boat that they built out of the broken up ship that Bering's crew, when they crashed in the fall of 1741. So they brought that back, and the Russians decided to allow their fur hunters, who had pretty much overcome and overtaken all the Siberian native people and had been harvesting various furs in Siberia. They now mounted periodic voyages crossing the Aleutians one by one. Their means of harvesting furs was to sit at home and capture and enslave the Aleuts. The women and children would be under guard, and the men would be required to go hunt the sea otter furs. So the sea otter expeditions undertaken by the Russians were all undertaken by the Aleuts, and the Russian strategy was simply to hold the families hostage at home. Pretty dire way to do things, but that's the early history of Alaska, I'm sorry to say. The Russian government organized after, this was even abhorrent to the Russians, so they finally organized it under a Russian-American company, under a ruthless manager called Baranoff. Those of you from Alaska, I'm sure, have heard of Baranoff. Baranoff not only conquered the people of Kodiak and Sitka, but he also established colonies in Kauai and Northern California at Fort Ross. The picture above is the height of the Russian occupation of Alaska at Sitka. Just a few buildings, obviously, but very substantial buildings. And below is Fort Ross, north of San Francisco in Northern California. And these are contemporary drawings, of course, of the time. So now all of a sudden we have the Russians expanding into Alaska. The Spanish are pretty excited about that. For 200 years, they did nothing about what they claimed to be their exclusive domain. And so they decide, well, we need to occupy Alta California. And the way they decide to occupy Alta California is send a few explorers with a bunch of Franciscan friars. And in the course of time, I think, as we all know, they established missions in California. I'd love to talk to you about how the missions were operated and how they treated the native people, which was pretty horrible. But the significant part is now California has been occupied, even insubstantially. So we have both Russia and Spain moving in. And guess what's not been touched? Oregon country. In my view, Oregon country is the last temperate region in the world to be occupied by Euro-Americans. The Spanish, after they occupy Alta California, sent some rather meager expeditions further north. The most significant one for our purposes in the discussion today is Juan Perez. He went in a single ship to explore the coast. He reached 5440 north latitude at Haida Gwaii, which used to be called the Queen Charlotte Islands, for those of you who are not current on the naming. There was another voyage. You've probably remember the name Hasita Head on the Oregon coast. This is the Hasita that we're talking about. He didn't get very far. He got to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, had a bad encounter with the native people, had some significant scurvy aboard. And so he sent his second, Bodega Ecuador, who figures very prominently in West Coast history. He sent his second north, and although he had significant scurvy as well, Bodega got all the way to Yakutat. So he reached Alaska probably for the first time, anyone but the Russians reaching that far north. Now, for all of you who are friends of mine and have been dying to hear about Captain Cook, this is my guy. And I hope I can show you why. Because up to now, we've had pretty insubstantial efforts to explore the west coast of North America, and there has been really no effort to look at Oregon country. And so Captain Cook is instructed, after 2 very successful voyages in the South Pacific, he is instructed to look for the Northwest Passage, which was rumored to exist for centuries, and no one had ever found it. Lots of rumors, but no one had ever found it. So Cook was asked to verify whether there in fact was a Northwest Passage. This is a quick summary of the 3rd voyage. I've written books about it, so you can find some detail about it that's not here on one page. But he found the Hawaiian Islands by accident in early 1778, and then came to the Northwest coast to look for this Northwest Passage. And he touched at Cape Foulweather, Oregon. So his first contact with North America, or at least on the west coast of North America, was here in Oregon. He arrived in a terrible storm that blew him far off course, but he knew he needed wood and water, and so after passing the Columbia River and Strait of Juan de Fuca without seeing them, he entered on the west coast of Vancouver Island at a place called Nootka Sound. Now, I could tell you that he moved forward into Alaska, found the ice pack, went back to Hawaii, and as you've probably heard, Cook was killed in Hawaii on Valentine's Day, 1779. But to my knowledge, the first person to write about Oregon was Captain Cook. And this is what he wrote on March 6, 1778. The land appeared to be of moderate height, diversified with hill and valley, and almost everywhere covered with wood. There was nothing remarkable about it, except one hill whose elevated summit was flat. This is St. Mary's Peak behind, if you're familiar with the coast, behind Cape Foulweather, or east of it. Lieutenant King, who also wrote a journal, was a little more complimentary. He was surprised that the 2 explorers who sailed to this latitude previously, that is Drake and Aguilar, were turned back by weather during the summer months. Because here they arrived in early March and the weather was wonderful. Now, I don't know how he came to that conclusion because, of course, as Cook called it, Cape Foulweather, they got into this horrible storm. But in any event, King thought Oregon was a pretty wonderful place. So, hooray for King. He said the land is of moderate height, free from snow, agreeably diversified with hills and valleys extending a long way back. So in any event, these are the first 2 comments about Oregon that I'm aware of that are written. Now they entered at Nootka Sound, and I show you these pictures to show you not only that the English treated the native people, I think, as if they were equals. And they had this artist on board, John Weber, who was an exceptional artist, as you can see. And while these are pictures considerably north of here, the Northwest Coast native people from Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia all had similarities in the way of their structures and their languages and culture. And so this is not dissimilar from what you might have found in Oregon and Washington coastal areas. A picture of Cook ships surrounded by the native people of Nootka Sound. You can see that they're pretty similarly equipped to the people that were here in Oregon and in Washington. The fellow on the right is wearing a sea otter cape. Probably the most significant thing from the Cook voyages, in addition to drawing a map of Alaska and the Northwest Coast, was his crew brought back sea otter furs and started a rush, a commercial rush for this area. The sea otter were more plentiful, of course, further north but nonetheless, it became a commercial haven all of a sudden, despite the fact that it was the last to be encountered by the Europeans. Now, I would hasten to add, although this is outside of our area of interest, Cook continued along. This is a view of an area in Prince William Sound, and the people in the foreground are Chugach Eskimos. On the north slope, when he encountered the ice, he almost was embayed by adverse winds that drove the ice against his ships. He then went to Hawaii. It's a fascinating story, hours and hours of discussion for sure, but he was welcomed with a huge display from the local Hawaiian people in January, and in February they killed him. Lots of detail to follow, but ask me a question. At the same time that Cook was sailing, the Spanish did as well. And in the 10 years that followed Cook, you can see all the lines. They had a substantial number of ships that covered all of the west coast to Alaska. So we don't want to think that just Cook was the one who explored, but nonetheless, a considerable amount of activity along the coast. The Spanish settled in Nootka Sound where Cook had been, and they established fortifications because this was the heart of the sea otter fur trade, the sea otter trade. So the sea otter trade commenced, and in this area, again, focused more to the north, and one of the captains, trying to sell his book, no doubt. I mean, each captain that sailed in the sea otter trade published a journal, as Cook had done successfully earlier. And this particular one decided to draw this map. And the map is absurd if you look at the details. But even though Cook had proved no Northwest Passage existed all the way to the Arctic ice, Meares decided to draw some lines, total speculation, he had no information, suggesting that if we looked harder, we could get to Hudson Bay. So the result of Meares' map, and by the way, at the same time, another explorer I should mention is the only American of note, and that's Robert Gray. Gray was actually a scoundrel, murdered native people, but also traded guns with them, anything he could do to get sea otter furs. But he was the first to get over the Columbia River bar, which is why we call it the Columbia River, because his ship was called the Columbia. So as a result of all of this uncertainty raised by these fur traders, Captain Vancouver was asked to come back. And again, I've written a great deal about Vancouver. We've heard the name Vancouver, but he actually was a person and had the longest voyage in the annals of British naval history and conducted shoreboat excursions up and down the coast. He met with McKenna at Nootka, and he conducted these small boat surveys. The one on the left almost looks like a camping trip, doesn't it? But in any event, he would take these shore boats and they would row, believe it or not, every inlet from Puget Sound to Anchorage, Alaska. So if you can imagine those poor guys, they must have pretty sturdy muscles by now.
Jim, we're losing your voice over here.
What's that?
Your voice is dropping.
Oh, okay. And I assume this isn't helping at all, huh?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll speak up, but please do say that. But in any event, the principal activity of Vancouver's voyage was these small boat journeys, looking at every inlet, trying to disprove Meares, because Meares said, well, one of these inlets leads to the Hudson Bay. So he mapped with a fine degree of accuracy the whole coast. And I picked for you, I mean, there are a series of maps, but this is the area from Oregon to the north of Vancouver Island. And you can see, you know, for the first time, Puget Sound has been mapped. These are maps that were in existence for well over a century after Vancouver left. They were the most accurate maps ever prepared for the area until the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey arrived. So at the end of Cook and Vancouver's voyage, on the left you can see what the map looks like now. Remember, I showed you the map from 50 years earlier where the Northwest Coast was a blank. Well, now we have a complete picture of the Northwest Coast. But the significant thing is we have Spanish California, we have Russian Alaska, but in between, besides the sea otter hunters that are working with the local native people, there's no European occupation of the middle section that is Oregon country. And in fact, this early map said it was disputed between Britain and Spain, but soon Spain gave all of its rights as it was about to be conquered by the Mexicans or kicked out of North America by the Mexicans. Spain turned over all of its rights and all of its claims to the Northwest Coast to the United States. So all of a sudden the United States and Britain had competing rights to this area called Oregon country in between the Russians and the Spanish. Who knows where the name Oregon came from? So lots of theories, and you're welcome to read them all. We've got a historian in New Spain attempting to describe the results of the Cabrillo voyage. There's a possibility that they referred to the plant oregano. The Spanish did. A Major Robert Rogers, a Brit, sought funds to finance an expedition in search of the Northwest Passage, suggesting the route is from the Great Lakes toward the head of the Mississippi and from thence to the river called by the Indians Oregon, which is presumably Columbia. Rogers also chose the word based on Algonquin words, East Coast words. We hope that's unlikely. My favorite one, but probably the least likely, is that there were Shoshone words that were mixed together to spell out Oregon and meaning River of the West in Shoshone. So anyway, pick your explanation. But in any event, now Oregon is finally something that people are contemplating. And as we all know, the Lewis and Clark expedition not only came west to look at Jefferson's newly purchased Louisiana territory, but also he wanted them to go all the way to the coast, and he popularized the term Oregon for the first time and asked them to get to the Pacific Ocean and learn about the waters of the Colorado and Oregon, meaning the Columbia. Lewis and Clark, I think we all know the story of Lewis and Clark. As Americans, we tend to think of Lewis and Clark as the guys who first found Oregon, the first European Americans, that is. But of course, Cook and Vancouver and all these fur hunters preceded them. But they're the first, certainly the first, to come overland. And they stayed at Fort Clatsop near Astoria, and there's a recreated Fort Clatsop, and the people of Seaside have built this so-called end of the trail. The end of the trail really was Fort Clatsop, but they came down to Seaside to harvest salt and look at a beached whale. So I think that's why the Seasiders think Seaside was the end of the trail. At the same time, David Thompson, who was a British merchant, came down the Columbia River. So now we're beginning to understand what our area of the Northwest Coast looks like. You can see Thompson had some pretty considerable walking to do. He came from Hudson Bay. He came from Montreal. He walked most of his life in pretty uninhabited or inhabited only by Indian territory. And finally, somebody decided to settle in Oregon. And we all know that Astoria existed in 1811. It's quite a fascinating story. There are books about Astoria, and I'd like to commend them to you if you want to know a little bit more about it. It was very rudimentary. It lasted a short while. War of 1812 broke out, and the Americans had to give it to the British. Their ship, one of the reasons it was so unsuccessful is their ship with all their stores, the Tonkin, had this calamitous experience with the Clayoquot native people in Vancouver Island, and it was destroyed. But at the end of all this, again, remembering that treaties have now been settled where the Russians agreed to stay in Alaska, the Spanish agreed to stay in Alta California. So the Americans and the British came together and established Oregon Country. And so Oregon Country extends from the California, what we currently think of as the California border, all the way to 5440 or Haida Gwaii, which is where Perez ended his voyage, and it was considered that Russia was above that. In the early years of this joint occupation, the British did a great deal more than the Americans. Fort Vancouver was established. Astoria was pretty ramshackle, not very significant, a dozen or so occupants. Fort Vancouver was huge. Now this is in the area of Vancouver, Washington today. It was quite large. It was a meeting place for native people to bring their furs. And of course, this is beyond just sea otter furs. This is all the inland furs as well. And from this place, ships would land and there would be significant commerce to China and the like. Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company operated Fort Vancouver. Trappers were prevalent, and Peter Skane Ogden is the first one to our part of the world. He found, was looking for the Northwest Company, working for the Northwest Company, and he has a Oregon history sign right here in Deschutes County. And I think you'll recognize that bridge. That's the Peter Skane Ogden State Park, as I understand it. But the significant part is these fur hunters working for Hudson Bay Company and their competitors were doing a considerable amount of investigating, not only looking for furs, but also trying to map the area for the first time. And I found this picture at our local museum. It's not really from Peter Skane Ogden. It was done 20 years later, but I thought it was pretty unique because of the Indian teepees and the fact that this is perhaps the first drawing of the Three Sisters. So in this period, fur hunting is the name of the game. And I show you for comparison all the fur hunting from Oregon to Alaska and all the bases that existed at the time. Nootka being probably the most substantial operation, and at least the Spanish thought that they owned it, but they soon relinquished it to the British and Americans. The significant part, as I wrap up now, is Britain has more or less controlled Oregon up to this point. You've seen that all the exploration, Ogden, Fort Vancouver and the like was all British. But then the Americans arrive. And as I'll try to show you in just a few slides, the overwhelming impact of the American arrival allows the United States to acquire a significant portion of what we call Oregon country. Jedediah Smith, he was principally interested in California, but every time he got down there, the Spanish kicked him out, and a couple of times he came north into Oregon to map Oregon, first American to do so, after Lewis and Clark, of course. But then the real significant issue, I think we all know, is the Oregon Trail opened. And the Oregon Trail opened with a few hundred settlers and then became larger and larger. And the interesting thing about the settlers as they arrived, particularly in the Willamette Valley, is remember what I told you earlier, the native people are dying out. And so there's really no opposition to their occupying substantial parts of the Willamette Valley. So 1836 was the first wagon train. Ah, louder. Okay. Why doesn't this work? Oh well. I think the significant thing, does this help? Oh well. John McLaughlin founded Fort Vancouver. I don't know if that's a name that you've heard, but he switched sides and decided to abandon the fur hunting because the fur hunting was essentially was diminished. And so McLaughlin decided that his strategy should be to quit the Hudson Bay Company, even though he's in charge, and take up farming in Oregon. And he essentially was the guy who founded Oregon City, which is the first large community that existed in Oregon. At the same time, 50 years after Captain Cook, the Americans decide to launch their own exploring expedition. And this is the Wilkes expedition. And they studied the whole area. And the most significant geopolitical undertaking was that they did a comprehensive survey of the Oregon country, extending from Strait of Juan de Fuca to the Willamette River Valley. So again, the Americans are finally showing an interest in Oregon country. And meanwhile, the British are finding that the area around the Columbia River has been depleted of furs. And so they subsequently move to Victoria. But not a Weber drawing by any stretch, but in any event, Wilkes did some drawing of this. On the left is an Oregon native from the Willamette Valley. On the right is Willamette Falls, which I believe are in Oregon City. The inside of a home. Remember I showed you Weber's inside of a home at Nootka Sound. This is not quite as exciting, not quite as well done, but nonetheless, Wilkes is trying to replicate what Cook accomplished, focused on Oregon. They found a large tree. And they went to Astoria. And you can see 50 years after its founding, or nearly 50, Astoria is not much larger. All the action's up in Vancouver. And although Astoria is now American again, Fort Vancouver is where all the action is. And so they did a formal report on Oregon, which is the first time that the Americans back in Washington became interested in the potential of the area. We have one other visitor, John C. Fremont. And you can see he focused on the Oregon Trail and was looking for the Transcontinental Railroad at this point. An interesting fact, I suspect none of you are aware of it, but when the area of Oregon was occupied by both Britain and America, there was no government. And so we were essentially an independent kingdom. And as the area grew, people came together in a place called Champaign, which I guess is near Salem. What? Shampooey. I just had a shampoo this morning. Shampooey. In any event, Oregon was the Shampooey district and Washington was the Clackamas district. And they formed a government and they passed some laws. And maybe we should have stayed an independent nation, who knows? But then it came to a crescendo. The Oregon boundary dispute finally occurred. We had Oregon country established in 1818, and the British and the Americans finally decided that they needed to decide who owns what. And this is very significant because, as I've described, the British had all the impetus to take the entire area in the early going. Fort Vancouver was established. They owned Astoria for a long period of time. Their fur hunters were, like Ogden, were running all over the state, and certainly Washington and British Columbia. They were especially interested in Puget Sound as the significant port that it is. But the Americans became more and more interested. And finally, after the Americans asserted the rights of the Spanish Treaty and asserted the rights of occupation that occurred, particularly because of the Oregon Trail, they were able to successfully mount their own campaign. In the 1844 presidential campaign, I'm sure you've all heard it, 5440 or fight. 5440 was, of course, the northernmost point of Oregon country at Haida Gwaii. So the dispute was substantial. Our president at the time was James Polk, who's pictured here. And Polk was fighting a war already in Mexico, so he didn't have the interest or the capability of fighting with the British. So he proposed the 49th parallel. And the British responded that they wanted all the way to the Columbia River because of their interest in Puget Sound. But their claim was weakened. Probably the most critical issue is that the Hudson Bay Company moved to Victoria during this time. They abandoned Fort Vancouver. And by doing that, they more or less left the field open to the Americans to claim the state of Washington, what's now the state of Washington. And of course, this is how it was depicted in the American press. And please understand, Britain was by far and away the most powerful nation in the world at the time. And so finally, it was agreed, the British, because of the move and McLaughlin's decision to stay in Oregon and become a farmer, the British had to abandon their claim to Puget Sound. And so Oregon country became Oregon Territory for us, and British Columbia, or New Caledonia, I believe the British called it at the time. And maybe the next installment will be, well, what do we do with the Oregon Territory? But as you can see, that encompasses some of Montana and Idaho, as well as Washington and Oregon.